Hi, and welcome to Bene Naras, where we talk about all things books and writing and Latin.
I'm Rachel Cunning, and I live on a mountain.
I'm Arianne Carroll, and I don't live on a mountain, but I do get to introduce Emma Vanderpool today. This is Emma. Say hi.
Hi, everyone. Salawete.
Emma is a fabulous writer. You may have read her Sacri Pulli or Candake Amani Reinas, which I always screw up, but hope I pronounced correctly this time. And she has just published a work on Eumachia. She's in her third year of teaching. She teaches at Springfield Honors Academy in Massachusetts and received her MAT from UMass Amherst, where, fancily, she earned the Distinguished Teaching Award, which she totally deserved. She has published several novellas focusing on ancient history, and she also doesn't live on a mountain, but she does like them.
Excellent. Which mountains are your favorite? Say the Rockies.
Ooh, I don't know. I'm a little bit biased towards the White Mountains up in New Hampshire. I haven't been to Colorado yet, though, so might change my mind.
Well, if you ever come, the Rockies are great, and I live in them. I want to first start off with a shout out that my kids in middle school love Sacri Pulli, like they love it.
Oh,
they are all over it. We didn't buy many of them in the beginning because we had never read anything you'd written before, and we've ordered more, so they're going to be in our library most assuredly. But there were like fights over who got Sacri Pulli when we started our reading program. So that's my shout out. My kids love your book.
Thank you.
So I want to know how you start brainstorming when you're thinking about a new project. Where do you like to start when you sit down and say, I'm going to write?
Yeah, so one of the first things I think about are like, okay, so where are the gaps in materials that are like readily available and accessible for students? So like when I was first starting out writing, I saw like, okay, there's a multitude of texts based on like everyday life in ancient Rome, as well as texts like based on like Greco-Roman mythology. But what I wanted to see was like, okay, so where are the gaps that I can fill? And, like, what are perspectives that have like so far been untold, right? But that should be heard by our students. So that's like a big question that I have when I'm starting to like brainstorm. Another thing I try and keep in mind is like, what's going to be like the most compelling, right? So like a lot of my stuff is based in history, which typically kids are like, oh no, not history. Right, so then
but you throw a chicken in.
Right, you throw the chicken in, you tell it from the perspective of a chicken, right? And it flips the story, right? It automatically kind of like gives it a little bit more like spiciness, some more like interest to students.
So perspective is a big thing for you.
Yeah, that's a big thing for me, considering like how we can retell familiar stories from like new and like innovative ways, for sure.
That's fantastic.
That's awesome.
And it makes them really compelling. Like, I've enjoyed everything that I've read that you've written.
Oh, thank you.
Well,
and then one other thing I wanted to share, if I may I?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, please.
Is, let's see if I can pull it up. I also have, if you guys don't know about this, a Trello board. Trello is a great like organizational tool. And so like while I have like, I'll jot stuff down on Post-it notes. What I have though is like, I have like a running list of like topics, right? So like constantly I'm like putting virtual Post-it notes on ideas like, okay, maybe this will be interesting one day. Maybe this is something that I can pull out of the closet, right? Which helps like keep that constant flow of ideas going and me constantly thinking about like, okay, what can come next?
That's a really excellent way to organize things. I love that you do that. I haven't used Trello for writing yet, and I obviously need to.
Yeah, right. So yeah, so like on the one hand, like I have like, okay, different topics, so like more animals to explore, but also like, okay, if I'm already set in a work, so I'm doing one of Milo and Clodius, so what are different specific aspects in the planning and organizing process that I need to like go through next, which is really helpful for me.
Okay. Yeah. I have a really quick
question. So you are more
question.
listy. Oh, go ahead.
I have a really quick question before we move on to the next big question, which is, I see you have names on there like Sophonisba. Be willing to bet if we conducted a survey of classicists asking, who knows who Sophonisba is, we would probably get you. And and the same thing with Candake Amani Reinas, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have a degree in classics. I didn't know who she was. How do you find some of these more unusual perspectives?
So one of the things that I just will go on like the Wikipedia plunge, right? So like if you start on like a big topic, like a familiar one, like say like Dido, right? Then you start like clicking on those like blue hyperlinks, and like that's where you find those stories that are like so crucial to history, and yet are so like undertold. And so I think in that sense, right, it's even more valuable to our students, because I think a lot of teachers, right, are able to write texts about like Dido or about Cleopatra, right? Those are stories that are familiar to them and that are probably more commonly shared in Latin classrooms. But what I want to hopefully do is like bring to the forefront some other important figures in history and untold perspectives.
I really respect that.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think a lot of people struggle with not just writing a story, but how to write specifically student-facing materials in a different language than their native one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there are a huge number of considerations, from research to vocabulary choice to grammatical constructions to complexity level. When you are writing, what are the elements that you weigh the most heavily, and what resources do you use for that?
Yeah, so again, the two biggest things I consider are like, okay, historical accuracy, right? Because I'm dealing with something like that did really happen. Right, so it kind of like can restrict like the liberties that I can take, and then also like how can I make it compelling. And so those are two big factors that I weigh. In terms of the language itself, I also try and think of like, okay, if one day they do encounter the text, right, where we keep coming back to, that's what I'm currently working on, Dido, right? So if we're looking at imagining that kids will one day encounter Dido in the Aeneid, what are some like linguistic chunks that I will have wanted them to like have acquired, to have like really gotten into their system, so that even if they don't go and read the Aeneid, that 20 years from down the line, they're not just going, oh, amo, amas, amat, right? But maybe instead they've internalized like, oh, dux femina facti, right? Like how much cooler is that, right? To like have your students walk away with that chunk of knowledge. So that's like something that I definitely consider.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
I don't like the amo, amas, amat. It's painful.
No, and we get it all the time.
Right, yeah, we get it all the time, but like parents will come up to us, you know.
And then you have to do like the plastic smile.
Right, and it's the least rich possible piece of information we could have left them with.
So I'm always interested in the story of what makes a writer decide they want to start writing. And sometimes it's, my husband asked me, and other times it's something very different. And so I'm curious what made you sit down to decide to write a book?
Yeah. So when I was in like middle school, like I had like some really good like teachers who like got me to do a lot of like reading in English and to read very broadly. I also did a lot of like reading of like online like fan fiction and like online like self-published works, right? And so like as like a 10, 12-year-old, like I was like down in my basement like clacking away, right? Trying to like imagine these worlds. And so now like as a teacher, I was like, wait, like this is a skill set that like unbeknownst to me, right, I was developing through my youth in terms of like both like reading broadly and like trying my best to write bad fiction. And so and so then again, like seeing that the needs in like the field and like the needs in the current like Latin novellas that are out there, I was like, okay, I can do this. This is going to be fun. This is going to be something that I really enjoy. And it really has become like a really big hobby of mine.
So one of the things we like to ask each other sometimes is what we're reading. Are you reading something right now that you like?
Please say fan fiction.
Fan fiction is fine.
Yeah, I'm reading some fan fiction, some like Harry Potter fan fiction. But like right now I'm reading like The Existentialists at the Cafe. Yeah. So, right, again, like on the one hand, that might not necessarily like seem like entirely connected, but because it's like pulling on the work of like real authors, but imagining them in like a certain context, right? That's exactly what we're doing, right? Pulling on real authors. So imagine like what would have happened like if Virgil, Horace, etc. were sitting around a table.
Fun fact, that's the first email Ben ever sent me, was what would Virgil's browser history look like?
Amazing, right? So like these are like the big questions.
Yeah.
Like reading like even like texts that seem like only tangentially related still provide models for like how we can write as well for our students, which I think is really important.
Yeah,
so we're not just, as you mentioned, like writing just like fact-based things, going through things line by line, which are texts that are out there, right, for students already, and not necessarily what our students need or want.
I really wish we didn't have to wrap up because I want to sit here and listen to you talk all day. But I think both of us have, we each have a follow-up question. Emma, you mentioned that being compelling is really important to you, and that's something that we talk a lot about in the CI community and in novella writing. But it's really hard to nail down what does compelling mean. What do you look for when you're reading things? What do you look for when you're writing things? What does that mean to you? Yeah. What feels compelling? So
I've been very fortunate as a young teacher to be in like, already have been in four radically different like teaching environments, like a middle school like up in like middle of nowhere New Hampshire, a middle school down here in Georgia, a high school in an urban environment in Springfield, Massachusetts, as well as teaching college students, right? So like trying to figure out, I can very clearly imagine like who is in my audience, so I can be like, oh, for sure, like Joe Schmo will be there, and like what could I make that will like appeal to both Joe in middle school as well as like Eva up in like high school, right? And so having like clear like faces and clear like audience members in mind really shapes like how I write, and helps me like keep on track, right? Because what I might find compelling is not always compelling to students, right? But again, having like that clear student perspective in mind has really been helpful for me to decide, as you mentioned, like that intangible like compellingness, right? Which is a word we often throw around, but like
but how do you measure
like
that?
Almost indefinable. Right, how do we measure it? How do we define it? How can we make sure our
I'm gonna say it's fighting over books. If there are children fighting over books and like racing to get to your class so that they can get the book first, that's compelling.
It's compelling.
Just gonna throw that out there as a definition. So I want to know, because although you've written several books in a very short period of time, you're kind of a newer-ish author, although you're very prolific, which I love, which is great. And when did you first publish Sacri Pulli? Because that was your first, right? It was like a year ago.
Yeah, Sacri Pulli was like just a year ago.
Yeah, so just a year ago, you were like, I'm going to write a history book, and it's going to be amazing from the perspective of a chicken. And I want to know what advice you would give to someone who is just starting out as a writer of Latin novels.
I think you guys have mentioned this in previous videos, but the idea of like just starting writing, because it can be so intimidating seeing that blank page, or so intimidating thinking about like all the ways you could go with a story, right? Because as an author, you have an almost infinite number of choices, whether it's about plot or grammar or vocab, but just like starting and knowing that like no matter what you do, no matter how perfect it feels or how wrong it feels, you're going to have to go through a very long editing process. I think is like a really important thing to keep in mind, that no matter what, you're going to be stuck going through it like 8 times. So no matter as long,
that's a minimum.
Only 8?
Yeah, so as long as like you get there. Yeah.
Well, that's great advice. And I think it's so important to reiterate that over and over and over again, that you just have to start because it's a process. And if you never start it, then you're not writing anything.
Right, exactly.
So I'm glad that you shared that and that you agreed to be here today.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for talking to us.
Such great authors.
We would love it if we could talk to you again on other topics later, if you would be willing to join us again.
Absolutely.
Next time we'll be discussing research tips, although probably not with Emma, unless you really want to join us. Since research tips are part of our own brainstorming processes, and I have to imagine you do research as well. Yeah. I cannot imagine not researching. And knowing where to find that and how to do it can be a struggle sometimes. So that's what we're going to discuss next time.
It's true. So until then, scribite with those bonis audibus.
Facite
Facite valiatis.